thank you for coming.
Oh, thanks for having me. How's everyone doing?
It's mid-afternoon.
It's nice to be back here. Yeah.
Yeah. I want to start with your company, actually.
Oh, okay, sure.
You know, we've been talking about a lot of the lean startup ideas. That doesn't mean we're not going to get there. We are.
Okay.
And there'll be time for questions as well.
Okay.
But I want to start with this idea, which I'm, just sort of naturally was very drawn to when I first started deeply studying kind of the economic answers to the questions I had, which is why were companies acting in interests contrary to society? Mm-hmm. It turned out that it was because they had sort of universally adopted a set of social norms that had to do with short-term thinking.
Yeah.
And these have been canonized in business school around, the shareholder is always right. The shareholder, the job of a company is to put money in the pockets of the shareholder. Mm-hmm. And that's pretty much the job.
Yeah.
And while that may not be the job on the ground for many people in a company, it is in fact the job of the board. And I'm on a public board, and I face those pressures personally. So tell me what the long-term stock exchange is.
Sure. So just to give you a bit of the backstory, by far the best thing about being an author, just for those that haven't done it, is you get to write this kind of last chapter of the book in which you list things that somebody really ought to do, and then you're done. After you've enumerated the things that need to be done, then you move on with your life. So I wrote a book in 2011, Lean Startup, and I had written about a number of things that ought to be done by somebody, and one of which I sketched out that since all the research on management that has ever been done shows that in order for companies to thrive, to adopt lean methods, to invest in innovation, to invest in their people, they need to have as a foundation a philosophy of long-term thinking. But everybody knows, and I didn't know anything at this time, but everybody knows that the capital markets, that the way we have our public markets, are the ultimate in a short-term pressure, short-term mindset, that therefore companies that are run that way are objectively worth less money than they would be if they were run for the long term. So it's not even good for investors. In Silicon Valley, people always say, oh, it's Wall Street's fault, investors are forcing us to do this thing, but it's not even good for the people who are saying that. If it's true that having a philosophy of long-term thinking benefits both companies and their investors, then there ought to be a way to make more money by having a new venue with a new social contract where people would be incentivized to do that. I think the best way to make that happen would be to create an institution that can change the rules of the game with new listing standards that really work for what companies need in the marketplace.
Just to be clear, when you say new listing standards, you mean as public companies?
As public companies, and therefore the right kind of thing to make would be a brand new stock exchange. So somebody really ought to create a long-term stock exchange, or LTSE, to embody this new social contract and solve this really profound problem at the heart of modern capitalism. Anyway, thanks for coming in. My work here is done. Put that
I'm on to flying cars.
Yeah, I'm going to finish this book. And anyway, somebody should take care of that. And if you actually go through, I've been very flattered to see the Lean Startup be adopted at so many companies, including at P&G. If you go through all of the crazy things that I listed that somebody really ought to do, almost every single one in the book somebody has taken a swing at, including ones that I would have considered to be much more difficult, like reforming government and reforming education. And people have really run with those ideas. It's been very gratifying to see as an author. And yet, for some reason, no one ever would call me up and say, hey, can I do the stock exchange one? So I never got that call. And so after a few years, I decided that, it's just one of these ideas that wouldn't leave me alone. It literally kept me up at night. I was like, why isn't somebody doing this? And why do we do things this way? And so I felt like if no one's going to do it, I ought to do it. So yes, it is a new company. It's called the Long-Term Stock Exchange. I've been working on it personally for more than 5 years. And it's to implement that idea that I had kind of sketched out long ago, now with a lot more detail behind it, obviously, than just that sketch.
So tell me a few of the fundamental differences of a long-term stock exchange.
Yeah, so we make the promise to companies that are thinking about listing their company with us that we can give them the exact same level of access to liquidity in the capital markets, but without the short-term pressure. So it's not some kind of alternative exchange. This is in the same regulatory category as the New York Stock Exchange or NASDAQ. And our goal is to have much closer alignment between the company and their long-term investors by creating an environment where long-term oriented companies and investors can come together for mutual benefit. So for example, we believe that the voting power of the corporation should be weighted towards those who have been in the stock longer. So not that everybody has the same power, but that people who are the citizens of the republic have a greater say in governance than those that are mere tourists passing through. And that's not to say that tourists don't enrich the life of a nation or a very positive force economically, but that's not the same. Being a tourist is not the same as being a citizen of the republic. So we combine reforms like that have to do with the governance power of the corporation, along with a series of executive compensation reforms, a number of disclosure reforms, and kind of, I would say, as a whole package, more of a return to an older idea of multi-stakeholder governance that used to be the way that all public companies were run, that it's not just about shareholders, it's not just about employees, it's not just about the community, it's not just about the environment, that a really high-functioning management team and board would consider all of those factors together so that we have a idea that we call community governance, where the company can invest voting power, not just in their financial shareholders, but also in members of their community that are really important to them. And if you think about, like you just heard the greatest example ever. You think about an incredible company like Ben was talking about, like Pinterest, and the very unique culture that they've been able to build as a private company. I think a really urgent question for all of us who care about the future of innovation in this country is what's going to happen to those companies after they go public? And this is one area where people's common sense and all of the academic research are very closely aligned, that investments in human capital, investments in innovation, investments for the long term decrease after companies go public, even though that's the exact opposite of what we would want as a society to happen. So we have I think a very urgent challenge to address, but therefore, as a business, putting on my founder hat, therefore that's what creates the opportunity for us to create something new.
Now, this set of governance problems, at least I guess a narrower subset of these governance problems, a number of founders in the Valley actually feel like they created a governance solution, which is give the founders supermajority shares and supermajority voting. So even after they go public, they still control the company. And these companies include almost every company that you could name as a unicorn in the last 5 or 10 years. From Uber, Google really started it in 2004. That has not actually panned out very well. It's created sort of a founder worship culture where founders have a lot of power and they don't know exactly how to use it. This tenured voting idea that you have, first of all, where are you in the progression of making this real, that we could take a company and actually do this with you?
Yeah, well, you can imagine the regulatory, technical, and legal issues to be worked out so that this is, when we talk about minimum viable product in lean startup terms, this is still an MVP, but it still takes a long time, just less long than it would have if we'd done it the conventional way. We have been engaged with policymakers on this for several years now, and we are hopeful that we can start operations this year. So this is not a theoretical concept. In 2018. Wow. Now, that means that we will have the legal authority to operate. That's different than, to take even longer than that to have business success, of course. But we did put long-term right in the name of the company, mostly for our investors to remind them that this is not going to be something that, it's not going to be an overnight success. One of those overnight successes that takes 10 years to come to fruition. So we're, compared to where we were when I first wrote about it, we're quite far along. We have, we've raised money. We have a significant team of experts, people far smarter than me, who, understand the lingo of San Francisco and DC and New York, all together. And we kind of see ourselves as ambassadors between all these different stakeholder groups to say, hey, instead of adopting really extreme measures, think about like Snap with their zero voting shares that really antagonize the institutional asset management community, instead of adopting kind of this very extreme form of pressure that gets brought to bear on public companies that is totally counterproductive. Like, is there a way that we can come together and adopt solutions that we all can defend and feel good about? Because even you take the dual class and the idea of the founder as kind of emperor for life, people are doing that because it's like a stopgap measure that we've adopted because there's so many problems with standard governance that founders are worried about. But if you really put it to founders, are you really prepared to defend the idea that your company should be a permanent aristocracy? And not just you, but your descendants need to be given unlimited power over this corporation for the entire, I mean, it's just, if you've watched Game of Thrones, like, you understand that there's problems. We all know, it's like we all know that that's not the best form of governance available, because we live in a constitutional republic. Like, we have a really good understanding of how you solve these problems from a political science point of view. And so, you know, there are good solutions available, and so we can adopt those if we kind of bring the knowledge that we have from our lives as citizens into the corporate governance arena. And yet, you imagine trying to do kind of the normal corporate governance if you're running a country that way, where, you know, anybody who happens to be in the country on election day, they get to vote for president and then go home the next day, and their vote counts. And also, they can borrow money and buy extra votes.
Well, that sounds achingly familiar.
I'm not going there, but we can certainly anticipate hypothetical problems that might cause. So, like, why do we do our corporations that way? Like, I mean, if we really take like these very basic principles about how we know voting systems are supposed to run, we can do a lot better. And even if you look at the way that, practically speaking, public companies actually operate, the vast majority of them don't even know who their investors are. So proxy contests are incredibly expensive. It's extremely difficult to know who to listen to, who has, I mean, it's just like a whole cascade of problems that are downstream from this root cause issue, which we have not set up the governance in such a way that long-term investors and company management know each other and have a sense of partnership.
Now, I want to pivot from this, although it's quite related, to the work that you do in, you know, the startup way and the lean startup. What insights can you give us as you work with so many large companies, and you work with them to try to transition them from a set of cultural norms and approaches and processes to exactly the kind of, you know, leadership through disruption that is the theme of this conference.
Yeah.
What are the sort of biggest mistakes or stumbles, and what are the things that you see that make for a success in that journey?
Well, this is the hard thing for people to understand, which is that companies that are of a certain size are extremely good at what they're good at. So the management system they have, the culture that they have, the systems that they've built, they're there for a reason, and often a very good reason. So the challenge in making a change is you can't be slapdash about it and just kind of randomly start changing things. You have to have a real deep appreciation for what the strengths of the company are, so that then we can use those strengths to bring them to bear on the new change. So if you look at the history of management and management thinking, so many of the most important management ideas that govern companies today, they came of age, you know, a century ago, when the level of uncertainty that companies faced and the kind of frequency with which they would be required to deliver new forms of growth and confront what we would now call disruption. They didn't have a need for language about that because it didn't happen frequently enough to really be remarkable. Like, that is now a universal experience when, you know, but our management ideas were designed at a time when that wasn't true. So to build a management capability that really can handle uncertainty, can handle disruption, and that kind of, you know, I almost feel like I can feel the eye rolls in the audience already. When we start talking about, you know, big company acting like a startup, the need to face disruption, like everyone's talking about that. But practically speaking, what do we actually do? Well, that's where I think having a kind of a theory of change is really important, where we say, yeah, there is an organizational form that's extremely well adapted to situations of high uncertainty. We call it a startup. And it means a very specific thing. And it's not just the Silicon Valley. A lot of people in this world are entrepreneurs, whether they know it or not. And there are certain kind of management practices and structures that support, you know, what at Amazon they call a 2-pizza team, right? A team no bigger than you can feed with 2 pizzas. So like there's a certain kind of set of problems in this world. They say, yeah, we got to put a dedicated cross-functional team, a small team that's really focused on that can do something like lean startup, iteration, minimum viable product, build, measure, learn. So that's an organization capability. Well, when you start to bring that to bear in a corporate context, everyone you're talking to about that, like if people are a senior executive in a large company, how did they get to be a senior executive? It's by mastering the company's existing management structure and doing it really well. So the hardest part of it is you have to tell people the very thing that made you yourself successful in your career, that's made your company successful historically, that's now getting in the way of the new thing that you want to have happen. And it takes a special kind of person, a special kind of leader to be able to recognize that the world has changed around them and to make that adaptation.
Right. Well, we are here at P&G, so you work with P&G.
Yeah.
How's it going?
Yeah, hi everybody. So look, I feel like my job, I have the luxury of getting to kind of parachute in from the outside at key moments in the P&G journey. They've been working on this lean innovation program called GrowthWorks that has been driving this kind of think like a startup into teams. And so I get the kind of privilege to see that evolution over time. And it's been both really heartening to see. I mean, the amount of progress that has been made, I think, is really impressive in the last 2 years especially. And also to be aware of all the distance that has yet to be traveled. And it's tricky, and it is something that being an entrepreneur really prepares you for, because with LTSC or any of the startups that I've ever built in my life, you want to celebrate how incredibly far you've come, but the further you come, the more you become aware of how much further there is to go. Exactly. And everybody's chasing that next thing. So I bet if we could get Ben back on the stage and start celebrating all the amazing things he's accomplished, he's yeah, but I have this next thing that I want to chase. And so transforming a company is a lot like building a startup. It has that same S-curve kind of product market fit and exponential change thing happening. So I'm very heartened by what we call the leading indicators of future success. And yet the basic mechanics of forming a team with dedicated resources, helping them pursue a minimum viable product versus something else, to grapple with the business model change and the consequences of the fact that the changing landscape of retail and all the stuff you've been talking about. Those things are extremely difficult. So it can sometimes feel like the early stages of exponential change. This is the curse of all startups. The flat part of the hockey stick is very frustrating. Yeah. Those of you who've been in startups, you know what I'm talking about?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Very much so. Are there questions from the audience? I want to make sure we have time if you guys have questions. Right down here, if we can get a microphone down. We'll just speak it out loudly so we can.
I want to ask you your opinion about Amazon, because, and I explain that, because often it's thought as a company that even though now it's gigantic, still maintain that logic of postponing continuously the benefit. So they seem to be free from this short-term syndrome.
I mean, Amazon's a very impressive company, and I can't tell you, I work with companies all around the world, and the number of times that the reason they're talking to me is because Amazon has entered their market is very, very common.
So you're a fan of Amazon.
Well, it's great. It creates a lot of business for me. And also, but come on, we're all Amazon customers, so we all know how great it is also to be their customer. And just think about the number of, I just can't even fathom the number of categories where they've entered and I'm now their customer. And what a great, just a really great experience. I think they are kind of predatory in a way that I don't think every company would necessarily want to emulate. And of course, it comes up a lot in the context of companies. I mean, I work a lot in publishing, and any company that's trying to sell through a retail channel like Amazon, it can be a very challenging relationship. And it's funny because a lot of, I'll use publishing as an example. A lot of people in publishing are afraid to do business model innovation because it might upset their retail partners like Amazon. And I always have to be the one to be like, Amazon doesn't seem to extend you the same courtesy. They're upsetting you, it doesn't seem to bother them too much. So can we have a real conversation about what's really going on here? So I mean, they really are the company that has, that I think more than any other is changing how people see the landscape of business, period. So I think that's incredibly admirable. Are there some downsides to their approach? Would I necessarily recommend every company emulate? No, but in terms of the ability to create new categories repeatedly through internal startups that are homegrown and then scale those, really pursue the opportunity when the moment strikes, I think that's pretty much unparalleled in today's economy.
Yeah, absolutely. Is there one more question, and then we'll be out of time? Anyone brave enough?
No pressure.
Got one right here in the front.
Just quickly, do you think that the tech companies, as we talked about so much today, can self-regulate?
Can tech companies self-regulate?
Well, they haven't so far. And I kind of feel like, listen, I live in Silicon Valley, and many of my friends are at those companies, and I don't understand what they think, how this is going to end in a good way for them. So I think honestly, just as a citizen, it's baffling. I think we've lived through this before in American history, though. We go through these cycles of boom and bust, and reaction and response. And it's, I think goes all the way back to the very first thing you said at the very beginning, is like companies behave in this antisocial way. Why? And like at some level we know why. They're paid to act that way. Everybody involved is rewarded for behaving that way. And then I don't know why we quite, like we want to act scandalized that that's the case, but actually it's very surprising when a company doesn't behave that way. I think we all know that in our personal experience. We think about the brands that have disappointed us over the years, or the companies where we thought we knew what they stood for and then we didn't. So we know that this is happening. It's one of these kind of emperor has no clothes. And I'll close with a moment that I thought was really poignant for me. I was, everyone knows Virgin America. It was just acquired by Alaska. Yeah, rest in peace. So, yeah, Silicon Valley's favorite airline for a number of years. Anyway, I happened to be in Washington, D.C., meeting with policymakers on the Hill and at the regulators about the LTSE and the need for long-termism. This is a few years ago. It happened to be, I think, the day of or the day after that merger was announced. So it was like right when the news was happening. And so I was checking in for my flight home from D.C. to come back to San Francisco. And all day, everyone I talked to in DC is like, is this really a problem? And what about this? And what about that? And it was this very high-level abstract conversation. So I was kind of pondering it over, and I happened to be at the check-in counter. There's a few flight attendants, baggage handlers. We're all kind of hanging around talking. And I said, hey, what do you think about this merger? And the person checking me in at the counter was like, oh man, capitalism today. Everyone knows that once a company goes public and the short-term pressure and investors and and they're just like, unloading on me about this problem. It was like the first person I talked to in all of DC who was aware that there was a problem. But you had just spent the
entire day with regulators.
I spent the whole day with policymakers and congressmen and all these experts. And the baggage handler had a much better grasp on the situation. I swear to God, that's a true story. So we all know this is going on. It's like the emperor has no clothes, and everybody knows it down to the person who checked me in at the counter. So like, what's our excuse for doing nothing?
Yeah.
Anyway, thank you all very much. Appreciate it.
Please join me in and thank you.
Thank you. Thank
Eric,
you, sir.
that's great.